Welcome to the Virtuality podcast. This is your host, Craig Herndon, and today we brought Hugh Hancock onto the show, who's most notably known for coining the term machinima. I'm going to be as bold to say that he's the Alfred Hitchcock of machinima content. So if you're not familiar, it's separate from machinima.com. However, he did create machinima.com, but he sold it in 2006. And he's very influential in the sense that after he created this community, it made it very easy for things like Rooster Teeth to come out with things like Red versus Blue and provide a platform for that kind of content to get out there, because machinima.com came out in 2000 and YouTube wasn't even on the scene until 2005. We also get into his VR game, which is kind of the reason I brought him on the show, is to discuss the challenges that indies face marketing VR games. So let's beam down right into the conversation. All right, Hugh, I'd like to thank you for coming on the show. How are you doing today?
Doing very well, thank you. How are you?
Also doing well. Got about a half a cup of coffee going. So,
Excellent.
Yep. And for the listeners, just so you know, so he's in Scotland, whereas I'm in the U.S. So I had to get up around like 5:30 this morning to get to our, because we couldn't record in the studio so early. So we're basically recording out of the producer's house. And so, yeah, I had to get up at like 5:30 to make sure I got here at 6:30 so I could be on the call at 7.
Well, thank you very much for being so flexible. I know it's always difficult sort of dealing with the across the pond time difference.
Yeah, and so the main reason I like was kind of fascinated and wanted to bring you on is, A, you're working on a pretty cool game, Left Hand Path. And then on top of that, you also have a very unique background in relationship to film, but most notably, and what most people know you for, is machinima and the art form. So for people that don't know, most people are going to be familiar with machinima.com, so he is the founder of it. However, it is separate from the actual art form machinima. Hugh, do you want to go into kind of the difference between typical film and machinima film? And since you are the person that defined it, I don't want to try and define it for you. So I was going to let you go into that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, machinima these days is kind of completely ubiquitous. It's essentially films made using a real-time 3D engine. Normally I tend to define it specifically as something that uses kind of motion capture or puppetry rather than traditional keyframed animation. But basically, it is film made in a real-time 3D engine. So any cutscene in any computer game these days would class as machinima. And the reason that's important and the reason it came about is because when machinima originally became a thing back in like 97 to 2000, it was an absolutely revolutionary concept that you could produce a animated film at the same speed as a regular, digital video piece, as opposed to enormously slowly as people like Pixar were doing in conventional computer animation.
Yep, and it's interesting that you said like 1996, 97, and I understand that some of the first pieces were with Quake 1.
Yep, the very first one was called, oh good lord, I'm actually blanking on the name. It was by the Ranger Clan, Diary of a Camper, and it was in Quake 1. I think it may have been, it was in the release version of Quake 1, not in Q-Test, but that was the first film that is popularly defined as machinima, and it was the heartwarming tale of someone camping a spawn point.
Perfect. Even at the very beginning of shooters, there was still the spawn camper. Excellent.
Oh god, yes, believe.
Oh, that's great. So to kind of frame a reference between like where we are today and where we were then. So 20 years ago, the idea and concept, it's hard to think outside of what we have now with YouTube and phones and everyone just kind of be able to make some kind of content very easily and get it out to the world and distribute it easily. So it's hard to imagine back in 1996, 97, especially for those who grew up after that kind of time period, I guess for them to understand how wow it would, the kind of wow factor you could get from, you mean I can just make a film in 3D and just as easily as I could with real film, and cheaper even if you're doing indie kind of stuff and using video games.
I mean, to give you kind of a context for this, the phone I have at the moment is the Google Pixel, and the video camera that is in that phone, even 10 years ago, would have made Hollywood cinematographers break down weeping with joy. If you weren't in the film industry for the last 20 years, it's almost impossible to imagine how much the technology has advanced and how much more we can do now than we could do then. I mean, I made a few live action films a couple of years ago using consumer level technology, and the quality of movement, the amount of shots, the variety of shots, the amount of footage, and especially the special effects that I was able to use were the kind of things that they were barely available for Return of the King. It's advanced so incredibly rapidly. So in 1997, when I first became involved in what became known as Machinima, the film landscape was thus. If you wanted to make any film, there were video cameras, but they were crap. No one was really going to use a video camera for any kind of serious movie making because the quality would just be appalling. You wouldn't get accepted anywhere. Even the earliest digital video. I'm just actually going to go over to my bookshelf. I have one of the sort of handbooks of the earliest digital video. The Guerrilla Filmmaker's Handbook by Chris Jones, who is absolute pioneer in this stuff. The third edition here, which is the one that really seriously focused on digital video, was published in 2006. Back in 1996-97, if you wanted to make a independent film, you needed a film camera. You needed a camera that would actually run through an exposed celluloid. Now, these things were enormously expensive. You weren't going to buy one, you'd have to rent one. It would cost thousands of pounds, and thousands of pounds in 96 was more, or tens of thousands of dollars, more than it is now. And then the really big problem was that we are used to the idea that we can just point a camera and it will just take almost infinite amounts of video. And, if you're going to shoot like 10 hours of video, you might need to buy another SD card. Oh, no. In 96, every single frame of film cost money. Wow. So if you wanted to make a feature film, you had to scrounge up enough money to buy, assuming like a 4:1 cutting ratio, 4 or 5 hours worth of celluloid film. That was thousands or tens of thousands. And so filmmaking was completely inaccessible to most people.
Right.
And then you had the issue that if you wanted to make a feature film that involved science fiction, I've always been coming from a sort of genre fiction standpoint. I'm fantasy, horror, Lovecraftian horror, all these kind of things. If you wanted to make something like that in 96 or 97, you needed the budget of Jurassic Park. People don't realize these days, I think, the Lord of the Rings films, when they came out, quite how much of a massive paradigm shift that was. That was, holy crap, how the hell did they do that? They had to invent entire new categories of special effects software just to do that. Their special effects crowd software, Massive, is still state of the art. So before that, you couldn't do it in Hollywood.
Wow.
You certainly couldn't, as a 20-year-old growing up in Scotland, hope to make a epic fantasy film or Lovecraftian horror film without going to Hollywood and spending your next 20 years in the horrendous treadmill that is there. And, we're hearing about how horrendous that treadmill was just now. So for me to come across the idea that this game that I was playing, obviously it's a computer game. It is a malleable environment that the game developers have crafted very inexpensive tools to adjust to your whim. And, I was seeing people coming up with, models and levels and all kinds of things for anything they could imagine. The idea that you could take this tool and you could use it to make films that would cost unthinkable amounts of money if you did them in live action or in computer animation at that time, it was incredibly revolutionary. I really can't overstate how astonishing it was, and how astonishing it was that my first two films were things that would have the things that would have cost millions of pounds or tens of millions of pounds to create in live action.
Yep. And what were you using to record back then?
It was actually all done within Quake. So the entire thing that got the Quake movie scene started was Quake had a function for recording gameplay. So that and they basically did this so that they could have a little rolling recording of people playing the game running when you weren't playing the game, like you did in arcades or whatever back then. And this was just a state-based recording of what was going on in the game at the time. So there was absolutely no reason that you couldn't get in there with a hex editor and change the camera values. And that resulted in essentially a film medium within Quake. So you downloaded these things as mods to the game.
Yep. And
then they ran and turned the game into a resolution-independent movie studio, which at the time, again, it was 96. You couldn't downloading even really low-resolution video took hours because we were on 56K modems.
Yep.
So having this movie studio that would just let you download and play back at 1024 by 768 or something. Yep. This was way ahead of its time.
Yeah. And it's, I guess one thing that's just interesting to me about that is that you've mentioned in the past how you see the need for film to be more democratic, where more people can participate in the creation of film. So at what point did you kind of just realize that this was a different medium of film? And what kind of led you to make a website to be able to distribute those kinds of films?
It was pretty shortly after I made my first film in the medium. I mean, what happened was I originally at the time thought I wanted to be a novelist because while I really liked the idea of making films, I'd done some preliminary research into how you did that and gone, well, that's never going to happen. So I was working on, my first novel at the same time as playing a lot of Quake. And some friends of mine decided to make one of these Quake movies that were getting very popular to promote the UK Quake scene. As a side note, this actually turns out to have been the very birth of the esports scene, and I may have, in fact, run the first esports news site in the world, which is how I became involved in all this.
I see.
These guys knew I was a writer, so they contacted me and say, would you write us the script for this thing? Because, we're having trouble with it. I did so. It ended up becoming the first film I ever made, Eschaton Darkening Twilight, which was a Lovecraftian story of the apocalypse. And in the course of this, I realized that this was a absolutely remarkable creative medium that enabled just unparalleled levels of freedom. And so I became one of the small group of people like Anthony Bailey, Paul Marino, various other people, Frank Delario, who were working to sort of give this a bit more prominence and turn it into a real respected art form. And in the course of that's when I decided that the appropriate thing to do was we needed a big, well-respected, high-quality hub to where all the creators of this art form could come together, share their work, and where they could be treated like stars. This was the core concept behind Machinima.com. And that's why I registered the domain, built out the website, and launched it to way, way, way more success than we initially expected in 2000.
Yeah, and what's really cool about that is, YouTube didn't even come on the scene until 2005 as an established company. So you had a site distributing video and actually read how you described in the past how you basically had to learn Perl and a whole bunch of other things so you could, be able to, you basically had to figure it out because there wasn't a YouTube, there wasn't any kind of way to distribute it. And you obviously don't have money to sell it physically, which is...
No, well, that was kind of the thing that it's one of the major things why Machinima hasn't become a bigger deal than it is because one of the problems Machinima had was it was always dogged by legal issues because we were using other people's art assets, the computer games, and so on. And transformative use in copyright law is not as robust as, frankly, I think it should be. it's always a problem that we couldn't just turn into a film distributor and start selling these things, and that has impacted a lot of machinima creators over the years. But yeah, back in 2000, it was 5 years before YouTube. There were one or two nascent video streaming sites, but they were honestly terrible. And so we were figuring it all out. I still don't code Perl. I may have made an entire large website in it, but I wouldn't claim to code it. That was an awful lot of hacking around and dodgy coding, and what a friend of mine referred to as various scripts that were the thread the entire site hung on. And we had to figure out the problem of distributing large files at a time when bandwidth was very expensive as well. And, a good chunk of my time was devoted to scouring the internet, looking for cheap deals on dedicated servers somewhere obscure that for some reason had managed to get a bandwidth, some bandwidth for a free or very low price. I think the worst experience I ever had with that one was we found a great host in Chicago who had a really, really cheap leased line. We were renting an entire server for the first time ever, and this was in about 2002 after the site had launched.
Yep.
It was still costing us a lot of money, but compared to what we were paying before, it was really cheap.
Yep.
And it was all going great until in the middle of winter, the thing goes offline for a week, solid,
Ooh.
no contact, no nothing. I'm getting increasingly concerned about this, and so eventually I contact the guys running the. I'll manage to get through to the guys running the thing, and their first response was, "Oh yeah, sorry about that. The server froze." I'm like, "Well, how the hell does that take a week? You just reboot it."
Right.
No, you don't understand. So the thing is, our server farm was located next to a lake. And it turns out the walls between the lake and the basement were not as thoroughly secured as they might have been. So in the Chicago winter, the wall broke. The lake flooded into the server room, and then the entire thing froze solid. So when we say your server froze...
It literally means your server froze.
Yeah, it was literally an ice cube. We unsurprisingly, we did not manage to recover anything from that one, but fortunately we had backups.
Wow. Foresight there for having backup. And that's a thing that another technological limitation at the time, because now you have AWS and Azure and all these different ways to where it's very easy to get it, and they even do the backups for you if something like that happens.
Oh yeah, these days it's just magical. Having worked with web technology for 20 years, this is nirvana in many ways. Just the ability to choose from a range of extremely cheap, hugely available, thoroughly reliable servers, hosting options, and having things like Hugo for static site hosting or Rails or whatever, I remember the first time I used Rails for a site compared with hacking together a dozen unassociated Perl scripts that you'd found in obscure corners of the web, night and day.
And so along those limitations of technology, was there, other than the legal issues restricting you from distributing, were there limitations to the technology about the kinds of stories that you could tell? What were some of the pain points that you ran into at that time?
More than we can count. Basically, a lot of the issues were around animation. That's one of the big problems that we had always. We still had to create the animation, and you can do an awful lot with the sort of library of inbuilt computer animations that the game has already. If you look at my feature film, Bloodspell, which was released in 2007 using the Neverwinter Nights engine, that's an entire 90-minute film, which actually got very, very well, highly praised, very highly reviewed. It was released at the same time as Neil Gaiman's Beowulf, and actually we did better on review scores than he did. And Beowulf may have had a little bit more money behind it. Yep. And an awful lot of that was created using sort of 5 or 6 different animations in the game. Like the get mid animation, which was in the RPG for opening doors and stuff. We used it for a wide range of expressive purposes. It is astonishing what you can do with camera angles. But still, we had the problem that animation was hard. It was expensive. You need special skills to do it. On Bloodspell, I was very lucky to work with a dedicated animator, Justin Hall, who did some of the key animations for us. But it was still a question of, we've got a 90-minute film. We have a budget for maybe a minute and a half of animation total. How do we best use it? So that was really tough. Just all of the digital content creation was always very difficult. And we got, as Machinima creators, we got very, very good at figuring out what the content we already had could do well and then tailoring stories to that appropriately. I mean, the second Machinima film I ever made, Eschaton Nightfall, was one of the largest projects ever in the medium. And one of the reasons for that was just because we were trying to take the game engine, which was, essentially a story about brown sci-fi corridors, and use it to tell a real-world, modern-day story of sort of supernatural horror. So we had to create everything from scratch, and that took forever. And this has always been one of the problems that Machinima has faced, is if you lose sight of the fact that you are trying to do things quickly, and that's the essential reason for using the medium, what you end up doing a lot of the time is creating a conventional animated film that just doesn't have quite the visual quality that it would if you were pre-rendering. So it's always walking the tightrope between being too low quality and ending up getting too caught up in animating things, at which point you start slowing down to an enormous extent. And that's a tightrope I got wrong, actually, with my last Machinima film, Death Knight Love Story.
Yep. And it sounds like just creating a artistic pipeline was a nightmare.
Yes. Well, to be honest, I didn't know the word pipeline was applied to this. I'm not even sure it was until about 2007. But yes.
Okay.
And you always had the problem that you were working with mod tools, which, game developers support out of the goodness of their heart. But these things are not a commercial product. You don't have the level of support you do on like Adobe Premiere. A lot of the time you are trying to do things that were not supported. For altering the camera angles on Bloodspell, for example, we had to... There was no inbuilt way to do anything but the most primitive camera work in Neverwinter Nights. You couldn't change the height of a camera, for example. So when we were doing a low-angle shot or a high-angle shot, we had to figure out a way to do that, and it was completely undocumented. What we ended up doing was using one of the game's in-game polymorph spells to make the character who was the cameraman invisible, and then basically if we wanted a low-angle shot, we would polymorph him into a badger, and if we wanted a high-angle shot, we'd polymorph him into a dragon. Wow. And all this kind of workarounds, we had to do for almost everything. I remember there was one shot where we had sort of a group of 20 monks walking up this great big set of stairs, and just getting them to all walk in unison was a nightmare because the game was not equipped to do that.
So I guess once even just getting virtual actors together, how did you have people coming in online to do that, or did you how did you organize your actors in the first place to even get them all into the film? Like, would you do a giant LAN party or
LAN parties? It was always LAN parties. So for those who don't know this, a lot of the Machinima I've done is created using the networking properties of computer games to have basically one person controlling one character in real time. So when I say we were using the get mid animation, we weren't scripting that. We were actually just all in a room, and I was saying, Murray, okay, hit get mid now. Okay. It's actually a tremendously powerful way of making films, and I'll talk probably a bit later about how virtual reality is kind of bringing that one back. But I have never shot online, or very rarely. It didn't really work then. I don't think it really works now. I mean, just the trouble we've had today getting Skype working kind of illustrates the problems. Yeah. And communication on a film set is utterly vital, and it's very vital that people get the full meaning of anything you're trying to say. You have to be able to communicate nuance, timing. Everything has to be exactly right, and I find doing that online is almost impossible. I've done a little bit of voice recording online, and I hate it because you don't get the same level of communication that you do if you're in the room talking to them, and you can gesture and they can see your facial expressions.
Yeah, that's why we encourage people to come into a studio here. So it's the exact same thing.
Yeah, well, absolutely. I definitely, if I was a little closer. So it's actually some of my friends' most treasured memories is our time developing the first one, Eschaton, Darkening Twilight, where we were working with a internet cafe down the road run by a guy called Paul Younger, who now runs a major news site, PC Invasion. But there was like a dozen of us crammed into his net cafe after hours with me desperately trying to fix the hacked up janky code that we were using to record things. And then every so often, I'd shout action and everyone would crowd into the server. And then, people would telefrag each other because they were coming in too soon or the models wouldn't work. There was one particularly memorable incident when we were shooting a scene where a helicopter sort of comes down and, Men in Black disgorge from it and all the rest of it. And because, of course, we were doing all this in the Quake engine, one person was playing the helicopter. They had written a console command, and when they turned up, they would turn up as a helicopter. But due to a slight axis fail, they teleport in and, get set up and... I shout action and the helicopter rises over the hedge and it's all beautiful, aside from the fact that the bloody thing's upside down. So I've probably still got that footage somewhere of this upside down helicopter majestically rising up in an Apocalypse Now type scenario. Then we had to reset that and figure out what happened and do it again. And for Bloodspell, we had basically 3 to 5 people stuffed into an incredibly small and incredibly hot office, performing, controlling various characters. And because that was an RPG, people could control multiple characters at once. So sometimes we had, huge crowd scenes and so on. And then we were using puppetry for the facial animation there as well. So we had 2 people crowded onto one computer with one person controlling the camera from the left half of the keyboard and the other person puppeteering the facial animation from the right half of the keyboard.
Oh, I would love to have seen a photo of that or just a video of them doing that.
I wish we had taken more video. I think we have a few bits and pieces around, but not enough.
Oh, man, there's like some CSI Miami stuff. You know how they always make hacking ridiculous? There's totally a scene where they're like, all right, oh no, they're hacking too fast for us. All right, you hack on the left side of the keyboard, and I'll do the right side of the keyboard. And they're like joint hacking. And it's just... That's what that reminded me of, is that scene of ridiculousness. But it's just interesting that you did it and it was actually practical.
Yeah. And it actually looked a lot like a CSI Miami scene as well, because we discovered the best way to get lip sync that looked good was literally just to kind of hammer at the keys in a fake film hacker style. So it actually looked like that scene I imagine must have done.
Oh man, that just the fact it's practical is hilarious and awesome. All right, so let's jump forward a little bit into like as the technology progressed. This would be after your Red vs. Blue kind of came on the scene, and so after YouTube came on the scene, like what happened as the technology got better?
Well, a number of things. Some of them good, some of them not. One of the not good things that happened was the Machinima community as a whole became very aware of the glass ceiling that existed for us, because there were some enormously creative people doing some really wonderful stuff. And some of the classic Machinima films are still totally worth watching to this day. There's some fantastic stuff there. Things like Still Seeing Breen or Hardly Working by Paul Marino, Male Restroom Etiquette by Phil Rice, loads and loads. I mean, I could go on for hours. Red versus Blue, obviously.
Yep. But
all of this stuff was using copyrighted assets. So we kept hitting this problem where we would achieve a certain level of quality where the mainstream showbiz world really wanted to get involved. Like, I think Larry King wanted to show Male Restroom Etiquette on his show, for example.
Oh, wow.
And then they'd go, oh, hang on a minute. This stuff has copyrighted assets. We can only do this with the permission of the games company.
Right.
And the games company, of course, is working in the games industry, which is, they're all enormously stretched, very high pressure. The last thing they want to deal with is some lunatic who made a film in their game and now wants to, take it onto Larry King. They have no idea who this guy is. They have no idea what the film is, whether they're going to get in trouble for it. So, of course, the legal departments kept doing the thing that legal departments do of saying, hell no. And so time and time again, we would see an enormously talented creator come up sort of through the Machinima scene, produce some amazing work, clearly have a fantastic, in an ideal world, have a fantastic career ahead of them, and then dunk. Oh yeah, you can't actually do anything.
The career doesn't actually exist. basically, right?
Yeah,
That's
exactly. I mean, I had offers from distributors you have heard of to distribute Bloodspell commercially.
Yep.
But it was made using a thing that was at the time owned by Electronic Arts, and we asked them if we could do a DVD release, giving the money to charity, and they were still like, yeah, no.
And so as people started recording more, have you seen, especially in the past like 10 years, the video game companies starting to lighten up on that kind of thing?
Yes, but not because of Machinima. The really interesting thing that has happened is the rise of the Let's Play scene. Because the thing with Machinima is we never had the force of numbers.
Yep.
There was really cool Machinima stuff coming out, but there wasn't enough of it that the games developers would really pay attention. And it wasn't directly enough related to their business model that it affected their bottom line.
I see.
But then the YouTube Let's Play scene comes along, and the YouTube sort of video game commentary scene comes along. And when you've got some of the biggest, some of those guys with millions of subscriptions, and they're just doing this, and you have a choice of, you can shut them down, but if you do so, this is directly your market who you are going to absolutely shit on.
Yep.
Or you can let them keep going and maybe even write an official license. That's why these days, there is so much game content on YouTube, but still, it is still very limited. I mean, some of the games companies did brave things to try and allow Machinima to exist, even sort of semi-commercially, and certainly to allow it to exist, which is really good. And I don't want to downplay their contribution. Believe it or not, Microsoft were actually the pioneers in this one, by country mile. They put out a license for Machinima that was surprisingly permissive, and it was way back in like 2006 or something, way before anyone else did it.
Yep.
Blizzard did something as well, although they subsequently went back on it for various complicated reasons. But yeah, the Let's Play stuff has really opened up the potential to distribute the Machinima. But you've still got the problem that you can put it on YouTube. And, let's say that you put a Machinima film up on YouTube, and that Machinima film gets you 1 million views, which is huge hit.
Yep.
You'll make $1,000.
Right.
Now, you've probably spent 3-4 months making that, even if it's a small film. If it's something the scale of Bloodspell, you've spent years on it. I mean, I spent something like 5 years on Bloodspell.
Wow.
And which for a feature film, for an animated feature film, is actually pretty good going. You compare the amount of time I spent on that to the amount of time that's spent on Sky Captain, for example, and it looks pretty rapid. And it wasn't the only thing I was doing. I was doing other stuff at the same time. But it's very hard to make a living out of doing that when you're going to make maybe $2,000 for that.
Yep. So I realized when I first heard like your explanation for what Machinima is as opposed to the website, that I actually have made Machinima content myself around 2005, 2006. So I was in a clan for Battlefield 2 at the time, and we spent a whole lot more time on our own private servers just messing around with the game and mods and all those kinds of things. And we ended up making a film with the Sir community. It's not really that great, but I was proud of what we were able to accomplish.
Fantastic.
Of
That's
just
really cool.
having those, like, getting 40 people on a server and then just having, like, lines of guys, taking pot shots and getting the right angles and faking explosions. There's actually one part where we have C4 on the ground to like fake an explosion, but in the shot that we had, we realized that whoever dropped it didn't put it where they're supposed to. So in the shot, you can actually see the C4 go down before we blow it up.
Yeah, that's a classic Machinima. That's a classic Machinima shooting experience right there. You should share the link in the sort of show notes.
I'll definitely put it out there. I'm not promising any kind of great story or anything, but it's definitely was fun for me to create at the very least. So.
Yeah. It was a great Battlefield 2 was a great engine. I never used it myself, but I saw some really cool stuff made in it.
Yeah, I think the most notable one was this is back when you like getting game content for YouTube and these kind of hilarious videos were just now starting to become a thing, right? Because YouTube just came on the scene.
Yeah.
And the mine video was making it. Basically, the game started out with this guy who went onto this map and he's walking around and there's no one there. So he goes to all the spawn points, all the flags, and there's just no one. And then he finds this building, and he just hears mine, mine, mine. And he goes to the top, and there's an empty helicopter pad, and there's like 20 guys jumping around going mine, 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 waiting for the helicopter to spawn. And then craziness pursues from there, but that's how it opens. And that was one of the more memorable ones for me back in the day from Battlefield 2.
I think I saw that one once. I wasn't into the community, so I didn't quite get it, but I remember it being quite a big thing at the time.
Yeah, so that particular... It basically made fun of things that people hate about users and the game in general. So, and I think nowadays... so I actually went back and watched it, and I was like, this isn't nearly as funny as I remember it. But definitely at the time when that kind of humor was new, it was like the most beautiful thing.
Yeah, it's interesting how some of that has aged well and some of it hasn't. Like the first Red versus Blue is still genuinely hilarious. It's absolutely superb. But this is one of the interesting things I find, having been in Machinima from the start, is these days people periodically ask me, how do you feel about the Machinima community? And the thing is, there is no one Machinima community anymore. There's a Machinima community for every game out there. Yeah. You know, there is every game of any significant size has people making movies in it, and that's just amazing. Yeah,
it's the fact that it's so easy to do now. As far as where you're talking 96, it was a full-on production. Spending 5 years in a film. So if you had the technology that you have now, how long do you think Bloodspell would have taken?
Well, that's interesting, actually, because I'm currently looking at virtual reality. I think has enormous potential for Machinima because you can use the virtual reality headsets and handsets to produce motion captured animation, which, you know, I bought my first motion capture kit in 2011 and it cost me 5 figures. And now you can do this with consumer technology. So bearing that in mind, it would have still taken a while. I mean, the thing with Bloodspell is it's not just a Machinima film. It is probably the most ambitious Machinima project, or certainly one of the most ambitious Machinima projects ever. Its scale is equivalent to the first Lord of the Rings movie. So while a lot of the content creation would be easier, and it would certainly look prettier, because damn, some of that did not look all that pretty. Although the interesting side effect of that is it kept us mostly out of the uncanny valley, which actually worked really well. I would suspect it would still take a year or so, maybe a couple of years. Crowd scenes haven't got that much faster. We'd still have a lot to cover. We'd still have a lot of special effects to cover. Still have a lot of custom coding. Yeah, it would be faster, but it would be more like 3 to 5 times faster than 100 times faster.
I see. Yeah, that makes a whole lot of sense. So yeah, let's jump over to virtual reality. But before we get to talking about the left-hand path. Just want to kind of set the kind of framework of, so back in 96, Machinima was new and it was this new film medium. It's kind of incredible that, you've been alive through 2 film revolutions, right? So Machinima then, and then virtual reality now. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I would actually say I've been alive through 3, although I missed one of them. Because the digital video revolution was also huge. And I didn't miss it so much as I came late to the party. But like I said, I spent a year or so doing digital video creation as well. And that is astonishing in its own right. It has its own problems. And I could easily do an entire podcast on the advantages and disadvantages of video these days. The fact that someone picked up an iPhone and made a film which was nominated, as I recall, nominated for, I think it was either an Oscar or a Golden Globe 2 years ago. Yep. That being Tangerine, that's astonishing. This is what Francis Ford Coppola said back in 1997. Film will only be a democratic medium when the Oscar is won by some little girl in Kansas who made a film with her father's camcorder.
Right.
And that is reality now. Okay, The people making it weren't a little girl in Kansas. They were hipsters in LA. But nonetheless, they shot this thing on fully consumer equipment, and it was amazing. So that's a slight sidetrack. I think I've actually been alive and involved in 3 artistic revolutions. This is partially just because 96 to 2017 there were a lot of revolutions. But yeah, it's remarkable, and the VR thing does feel very much like the early days of Machinima. It's got the same energy. It's got the same community spirit. It's got the same feel that this is something absolutely amazing and truly revolutionary. And in all honesty, I would say that virtual reality is significantly more revolutionary than Machinima. It's got the energy of something genuinely new coming into the world. And with Machinima having, 20 years later, did it achieve exactly what we were all hoping? No. We didn't end up with Machinima films in Hollywood yet, although give it another 10 years. And you could actually argue, interesting point, you could actually argue that Avatar was a Machinima production. It is using the same technology, basically. It's the highest budget Machinima production ever, but it fits all my criteria. They shot most of it in real time in Motion Builder. They rendered it subsequently, but that's a sensible step. It was done using puppetry. Most of it was motion capture. So you can argue this stuff just went mainstream.
So that,
and LucasArts,
I just want to kind of point out the definition there. So it's not just game content. It's about it's all animation. Or like what makes it different from, say, an animated film that Pixar puts out, and something like Avatar, or something you'd make from a game?
So there's kind of there's a tight definition which I can use, which encompasses everything, and there's a sort of spiritual definition. I think the spiritual definition is more interesting, which is an animated film is a film made in the way that you associate with animation. It's painstaking, it's slow, you aren't doing anything in real time. There is no spontaneity in the larger performance. Obviously, animators are very spontaneous people in how they draw and so forth, but it's all incredibly painstaking. If you want someone to wave, then you move the hand a little bit, and then you place a keyframe, and then you move the hand a little bit more, and then you place a keyframe, and then you move the hand a little bit more, and then you place a keyframe, repeat, and then you go back and twiddle it all for ages until it works. It is slow, it is painstaking, it produces some remarkable works of artistic beauty, but it's not exactly shooting from the hip. Machinima, by contrast, is shooting in the same way that you would shoot a real-life film. And it can be a very high-budget real-life film or a very low-budget real-life film, but the important idea is that you are bringing the paradigm of theatre or live-action film to a entirely digitally created medium.
Okay,
and that's why I think there was a solid argument for Avatar being a Machinima movie.
Perfect. And I cut you off a little bit earlier, but you're about to make a comment on LucasArts, if that
just that LucasArts have, the Avatar as Machinima thing is a little bit questionable, because, to be honest, because while they did use motion capture, they subsequently massaged it to hell and back, and I know some people are involved in that. Yeah. So I'm being slightly facetious with the Avatar comment, but I know that LucasArts have actually looked at doing a direct live real-time shot production in the past, and it's still stuff they're experimenting with, so we may see that yet in the future. It'll probably come into TV before film, because the economics of TV mean that being able to produce stuff fast is super, super important. Yeah. And the big advantage of a Machinima pipeline is that you exchange a bit of control, well, quite a lot of artistic control and a bit of quality for enormous speed.
Yep.
And this actually segues into virtual reality very nicely, because one of the things I have been discovering about virtual reality as a medium is that I'm able to produce epic content incredibly quickly. And that incredibly quickly for me, for a novelist, you'd be like, oh God, this is so slow that I just want to stab myself with my pen. But for someone who's worked in animated film, the fact that I was able to solo create a 15-hour narrative experience inside just under a year plus polishing time, just over a year plus polishing time, is remarkable.
Yeah, and which engine are you using?
Unity.
Yep.
I've tried both the big ones in the past, but I may experiment with Unreal for the next thing, but I still feel like the pipeline is more suited to bigger teams, and my team fits in a broom closet. So,
so I think with Unity and some of these other tools, there's a lot of really unique tools in them. So some of which are actually made to make Machinima easier. So you could have a real cameraman controlling a camera and able to change the lenses and add all of these things in game while he's standing in the scene.
Absolutely. Yes.
And you can do all these things that just wouldn't be done before, to where you really are controlling this virtual camera like you would a real camera.
Yeah, it's not something I did a lot with Left Hand Path, because Left Hand Path is more of a conventional game-like experience, but it is something I've experimented with elsewhere. And yeah, as I said, virtual reality has enormous potential for Machinima. I actually did a little bit of this while I was doing the publicity for Left Hand Path. It was very interesting. When time came to create screenshots, I thought about, okay, I'll just sort of go through and screenshot from my perspective. And I thought, well, no, this VR. It's actually very, very easy. It took me about 5 minutes to put together a camera that I could pick up, like a physical object in the game that I could pick up and point at things and press the trigger button and it would take a shot. And I could, I had a nice big screen that I could set up my framing on, and it would have been a matter of another minute or two to add in sort of depth of field, focal length shift and zoom and all the rest of it.
Mm-hmm. And that's where the speed comes in.
Yeah, absolutely. And the paradigm works incredibly well. We have millions of years of evolution to make us extraordinarily good at picking something up and aiming it at something. We've hunter-gatherers had that one down a while ago. Whereas, piloting something on a computer screen and trying to get a perfect line up a perfect shot in there is rather newer. So there is this interesting natural feeling to creating art in virtual reality.
Yep. So I actually want to get into Left Hand Path now. And so the very first question I have, are you left-handed?
I'm not. I'm right-handed.
You're right-handed. All right. And so then I would assume that the origin from Left Hand Path is referring more to the occult left hand kind of spells being more dark in general.
Yes, it is, absolutely. And that distinction is in the game. The game's plot is not, and setting is not insignificantly based on real-world esoterica, particularly some of the branches of Kabbalah and some of the stuff that people like Mathers came up with in the 17th century. And the left-hand path idea came out, I think, shortly afterwards. I think that actually a Victorian concept. But the left-hand path, the character in the game is inadvertently very much involved in the activities of people who are decidedly on the left-hand path. And at various points, you have to make decisions or choices based around that path.
So a lot of at least the early monsters are humanoid. Is there a reason for that? Were you trying to go for like an uncanny valley effect? Because I think you were, at least with the very first monsters that are like the white, almost zombie-like, I guess.
Yeah.
That's the feeling that I got.
Let me think about that for a minute. Well, the very first creatures, they are humanoid because they were human. So to spoil the game a little bit, one of the conceits of the place that you are in is that things that die don't stay dead. And the fact that your character respawns and comes back to life is actually built into the game and is a plot point at at one point in particular.
And that's from part of the Dark Souls influence?
It is. It was originally from the Dark Souls influence, and then it organically grew from there. And I believe that Bloodborne did some similar things with kind of actually having your character coming back, being built into the world, but I haven't played far enough through Bloodborne to have got to that bit yet. So that was much more a case of parallel evolution.
Yeah.
But the husks are the zombie-like, ghoul-like, whatever you want to call them, creatures, are the unfortunate ones. If you die in the Well of All Reward, which is the place the game is set, and you do not have any kind of magical power or ability, you come back as a shambling, mindless thing that's just trying to collect the husks of other creatures to survive. The husks are kind of life force or memories or various other things that, if I use the word kipulth, that will mean something to about 3 people.
So for people that don't know, you play very much as a wizard that's coming into. So I'm right that the character doesn't really know too much about their own background, and you just kind of learn it through writing.
Yes,
and a lot of these notes that are creepy because you got blood on them.
Yes. Yes, the character. It's hard to say too much without spoiling.
Yep.
Suffice it to say that the identity of your character is both very much a central part of the game. I will say it's not an amnesia. It's not an amnesia plot. And yeah, it's multi-layered.
So some of the mechanics I thought were kind of neat is there's a few spots where you have to crawl down and actually duck down to get under. Mm-hmm. So I saw you because for people that don't know, in VR games, you can't really control, at least it's a faux pas, to control the head of the user. So you can't just have a wall stop the user from moving their head. So they can move their head past the walls. You have to deal with that in some way. And the first time you do it in this game, you're going to freak out because there's going to be blood riding in front of you telling you to lower your head. And
yes, I just saw someone go through that yesterday night, actually. It's always interesting to see how people react.
But I feel like a lot, at least in the early part of the game, there's very much like a claustrophobic feeling, and you don't have enough power to have like light up the room or anything. So you set that like you're very much vulnerable right now. Is the feeling
that's
and then is that what you're going for?
Absolutely, 100%. Yes. The entire one of the big things that I've actually gotten quite a lot of flack for in the game. People, not everybody likes this decision, but I'm standing by it. It's exactly what I intended to do with Left Hand Path. Is that in Left Hand Path, you cannot effectively fight back in melee. I mean, with the aid of magic you can, but you can't hit things with your stick, and you are very, very fragile. At the start of the game, monsters will kill you in 3 hits, and that's all deliberate because you're not playing. And I actually added in a line in the tutorial to kind of express my design philosophy with this, which is this game's designed to make you feel like a scared, fragile human, because while as animals go, humans are remarkably tough. There's the surgery on the kind of surgery that humans routinely undergo and survive even without anesthetic would be an exotic way of murdering just about any other animal on the face of the earth. The fact is still we are fragile creatures. Physical violence is really bloody dangerous, and in this game you are not playing a bemuscled Superman. You are playing a fragile person who has had some horrible stuff done to them and has, there's reasons why that is a complicated statement, but I can't say more without spoiling.
Yep.
And you are meant to be scared for your life in this place. You are exploring somewhere well beyond the grasp of normal human experience. And
you set the stage where people are uneasy, and another mechanic that you have is that you have to draw the spells in real time with your left hand, based on the design that the spell is. So if it's an X, you make an X with your hand, or like one of them's an hourglass type shape. And you have to remember the spell in order to cast it. But not only does it cast, you have to hold your staff and aim with that at the same time. So you're freaked out, you're already shaky, and now you're like, wait, what do I remember this spell? And it seems a lot of people default to all right, if I do a circle, I get a fireball. Like, that doesn't require a lot of thought.
Yeah, well, this was actually deliberate, partially because of sort of thinking about the world. If you're going to create a defensive spell, I've trained martial arts in real life for a couple of decades.
And I've seen you've done Muay Thai before.
Muay Thai, Jiu-Jitsu, historical European martial arts, various things in that, longsword, Navajo knife fighting, bit of Krav Maga. Yeah, I am generally interested in violence. And one of the big things that you learn if you look at any kind of practical self-defense system is that when people panic, they lose fine motor control. So if you have some terribly sort of complicated Jeet Kune Do trapping maneuver that you're very good at under calm circumstances, now if you fight someone who's really good at Jeet Kune Do, they can still pull that off and you will be very confused and also concussed. But most people, if they've learned that to a certain degree, when they get into an actual street fight or any kind of real fight where adrenaline is flowing, that all goes out the window. And this is why things like Krav Maga and sort of the Bullet Man systems, which actually try and train you in having sort of adrenaline rushes and putting you in a real like situation.
And a lot of the motions there tend to be more natural, right? Where your body wants to go.
Big muscles, simple motions, natural. Elbow strikes are very good. And hence why most of the combat spells in Left Hand Path, the kind of stuff you're going to be casting in the heat at the moment, are extremely simple symbols. Both because I knew that would be the simplest thing for a player to do, and also because it makes sense. The mages, there's going to have been an evolution there. The mage who was trying to cast Tarn, which is this very complicated vase-like shape, while something's trying to eat their face, would probably not have survived. So yeah, all the basic spell is simple for a reason, but it's still, as I'm sure you found, very hard to pull off sort of the first few times, and that again is very much by design. One of the things I wanted to do with Left Hand Path, I don't really like the thing that a lot of fantasy games do of the spells are basically a menu system. You choose your spell from your menu, and then you just click a button and your character casts it. I think VR is not the same as a computer game, so I wanted the spell casting. In this game, you don't just pretend that you are a mage with mastery of magic. You actually have to master the skill of casting magic in order to progress. And it's always really interesting for me to look at the difference between even someone who is highly competent. Like I have a friend of mine who is one of the foremost experts on longsword fighting in the world. You give him anything long and pointy and he's absolutely deadly. But him going into Left Hand Path, having done a bit of practice with the spell and then getting jumped by the first husk, panicked, shot a wall, died, usual stuff.
Yep.
Whereas on the other hand, if you see me, obviously I have a certain amount of experience in Left Hand Path now, it just becomes absolutely natural and instinctive.
Right.
And that is a really interesting progression that you don't see in many computer games outside of things like, I guess, the fighting games.
And you encourage the user to go back to where they last died by having the husk system, where when you die, you lose all your husks, and if you want to get them back, you have to go back to that spot.
Yeah, it's a mechanic I really like in the Souls games. It's a very, very nice balance between having a permanent cost for death, but at the same time not having too much of a permanent cost, because this is a Souls-like game and you are going to die a lot.
Yeah, and for people that haven't played the game, the husk can be used to buy upgrades and new spells. Basically, it's your progression system through the game.
Yeah. The screaming heads, which is the equivalent of what fires in the game.
And the basically the shopkeeper for the husk, really creepy as well, because it like whispers you.
Yes, and various people have pointed out that they feel a little uncomfortable with the shopkeepers, because at the end of the day, it seems a lot like husks are memories or remnants of the real world, and essentially you're being given power in exchange for cleaning these things up by some decidedly suspicious-looking characters.
I mean, you feel like you're buying dark arts, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's so one of the things. Like some of the newer monsters you've added. So one of them is like this thing with like small wings and it's got antlers. And it, again, that one is a little bit more humanoid, but you also have these more ghost-like creatures. So you started out with more humanoid ones, but now it seems like you're trying to introduce more, as players get better with the game, ones that are a bit more challenging. Yeah. But is there something you're also trying to do with the story by making the monsters get bigger, harder to fight?
So some of this is story based, because the very first extremely non-human creatures you will encounter, there is a power struggle. There is a power struggle going on in the well. Sorry, no, one sec.
Yep.
There was a power struggle going on in the Well of All Reward between multiple factions, or multiple things in the world, one of which is the forces of oblivion that rise up from below, and they tend to be much more non-human than the things that came there, which often once were human and then were twisted in something else. So some of that is story based. Some of it is also just as the later levels were obviously added later into early access, and as I got more confident with programming in VR, I was able to do more ambitious things. For example, the first levels, the characters are the enemies are all to a greater or lesser extent humanoid, as you say. They all move like humans. They walk along the ground. Whereas in Gamichikoth, the area where you first encounter the non-humans, I was feeling confident enough with my programming at that point that I was able to program these spider-like enemies and have them climb on the walls and the ceiling and drop on you and do various things that were not that are really not built into Unity.
Yeah, that's terrifying. Thank you.
Thank you.
For fueling everyone's nightmares. And so some of the other things you like, the spells that you get, one of them's like a kind of like a fire whip. You have the fireballs we mentioned earlier, and like the snow ice attack, I guess. It seems like there's a lot of D&D influence as far as like the kinds of things you're introducing. So do you play tabletop RPGs?
I have played tabletop RPGs for, at this point, 34 years, yes. The spellcasting is kind of divided into two halves. Certainly the kind of utility spells they're very much or a lot of them are in the same kind of school as the sort of your conventional spells in D&D or in that kind of tradition. The ritual spells, I think, are much more unusual in that that's actually using an entirely separate system of ritual magic, which is much more deriving from historical sources. And kind of fantasy literature where you have wizards casting rituals, but you don't really see it in computer games. And that's also where I think the spells deviate quite a lot from the kind of more standard attack spells or melee spells or whatever. And, some of those spells are quite dangerous. I don't know if you've gotten far enough in the game to encounter Rayshud.
I have not.
Right. When you cast that, let's just say that there is a ritual there is an achievement for surviving and casting that ritual.
That is awesome. And so does that sounds more like a Lovecraftian influence, where in Lovecraft humans can do magic, but there's always negative consequences that can come with it, and so that sounds very similar.
Yeah, I mean that's that and things like it are also Tim Powers, another great writer on sort of fictional magic. Very similar themes in a lot of ways. He was heavily influenced by Lovecraft. Also, David Lynch is a heavy influence on both the storytelling and the kind of supernatural in this game. And I don't think anyone, including David Lynch, could tell you what his influences are, but it's in there. And all of the one thing they all have in common is that magic is weird, it is uncomfortable, and it is dangerous. And that's something that I've tried to weave in throughout the entire magic system, and also through the story and the environment, because the place you are in is in its nature a magical construct.
And since you recently came out of early access, are you done, or do you have plans to add more?
I am mostly done. It's a 15-hour story at this point, so I think it's, if not the largest dedicated VR single-player experience, it's certainly in the top 3. I think it may be the largest. I haven't done like a really thorough check to see. And obviously, I suppose Skyrim just came out, but that's not a dedicated VR experience.
Yep.
So, yeah, the story is finished. The story is complete. I may do some more polish. I may yet add a secret ending. But other than that, I am, at this point, it's done. It's a complete experience. And I'm starting work on the next thing.
Awesome. Are you ready to talk about the next thing that Strange Company is working on?
Yeah, it's incredibly vague, but I will say that it's probably going to be more of a dark fantasy than out-and-out horror experience. It is probably going to be something heavily influenced by games like The Witcher 3 and Skyrim, in that it will be a world you can get lost in, and I thought The Witcher 3's storytelling was unparalleled. It's the Casablanca moment in storytelling for me. And it's very, very similar in tone to my natural storytelling tone. So there's probably going to be a lot of influence there in terms of it won't be a horror game, but it doesn't mean the world will be nice. And that the next game is not going to be magic focused. I am probably going to be focusing on melee combat, because that is something really want to get right in VR. No one's done an RPG with particularly good melee combat yet. I think the best melee combat in VR is Gorn. And I'd really like to get something that feels real, feels solid, feels like you are wielding a weapon and it is working the way you'd expect. And
so on that world building side, I want to make the comparison again to like where the technology was in 96 to where it is now. So with VR, it's intensive. We have to run these things at 9 frames per second and deliver it to both eyes. And so it kind of limits the amount of mise en scène that you can put into the scene.
Yes. Yes.
So like, what's the technology limiting you now from what you want to do?
That's a question I'm going to be more able to answer when I've done more testing. It is interesting to me how far you can push it at the moment. One of my rules with Left Hand Path was that I would never start out by doing things that I wouldn't sort of look at an idea and go, well, I think that probably won't work in VR because it'll be too performance intensive, so I won't do it. What I always did was tried it, and then if it turned out to be too performance intensive, dialed it down a bit. And it actually turns out you can push things a lot further than you think you could. Particularly the later sections of Left Hand Path, there are some pretty expansive environments there. There's a lot of graphical detail. There are, significant numbers of monsters attacking you at some points. It's a much less restrictive than you would think if you sort of listen to the horror stories about, you've got to be incredibly limited in your polygon count and you can't do anything. So I will be interested to see. I am a little bit concerned about CPU limitations in terms of physics. Because melee combat, you absolutely have to have good physics to get it for it to feel right. One of the big problems with most existing VR games in terms of melee is if you hit something, it doesn't, feel any impact from that blow.
Yep.
Your sword just goes into it and through it, and that's rubbish. So I've been experimenting with sort of IK systems and much more sophisticated than you normally see, sort of ragdoll systems, the kind of things you see in AAAs at the moment.
Yep.
And I'm a little bit worried that I'm going to get a lovely system there and then have to dial it down because the CPU can't handle it. But having said that, the other great thing about this is it's a very, very rapidly moving target. When VR first came out, I was on a GeForce 780, most people on 970s. And now, less than 2 years later, we've got a lot of people on GeForce 1080s. I'm on a 1080 Ti because I thought, what the hell?
Laptops are 1060.
Yeah. Even laptops, like I say, 1060s or whatever. In another couple of years, which is when I expect to, have this thing out fully, or even, in a year or so, it might come out in early access, the horsepower is going to be a lot greater. And particularly in terms of CPUs, I've just bought my system's got a Ryzen in it. The kind of 8 core, 16 core, very, very powerful CPUs are continually evolving. And so it's such a moving target. And that's one of the reasons why I took the approach I did with Left Hand Path, is I'd prefer to have something that scales well in the future. So, well, that'd be very interesting to see. But I suspect that a lot of the things that you would think, we can do this in AAAs, but we can't do it in VR, are also the kind of things where you would also say, well, we can do it in AAAs, but we can't do it as an indie because the art budget required is too intense.
Right. So one tip there as you start going down the IK path is it's something we ran into with the game that Digital Precept's working on, which is my studio, is that IK is very CPU intensive. So you want to make sure that you only want your NPCs to have it on when the user can interact with it. Otherwise, you need to have it off. There's a lot of toggling that you need to do because you're wasting resources if you just have it automatically on all your NPCs.
Yeah.
Like
that's a really good point.
Yeah, we made that point, and we went from we'd finally gotten it where we introduced enough enemies where at some points it would drop to 70 frames per second. We made that change. We went up to 240 frames per second.
That's not bad.
So just one thing to kind of keep a reminder of. So one thing I haven't talked to you about yet that I do want to touch on is your experience with motion capture. So you're saying it was $5,000 for the original set. And did you ever deal with oh, okay. And did you ever deal with like OptiTrack? Because I know those are like the $40,000 systems that I think, the Void and Hollywood typically use.
So I've used 3 motion capture systems significantly. The first one was an OptiTrack system, which was the 10,000, or I think about 10,000 optical system, which did wonderfully well. Made most of Death Knight Love Story with it. At the time, it was remarkable. I do absolutely hate optical motion capture systems now, and ideally, I would never like to touch one again as long as I live.
Yep.
The cleanup is a nightmare, and you just never get away from it, really.
And so did you try and use the Kinect?
For about 5 minutes.
Yeah.
I think I got the first Breckle Kinect thing. I did a test on it. I saw how long it took to process. I went, I'm buying this because I want to make things fast, and I uninstalled it.
Yeah.
So I never tried to use it seriously. I already knew there were going to be huge occlusion problems. And the thing is, a lot of the sort of single sensor solutions are great if you're going to have one guy standing there and talking.
Yep.
But my output more tends towards fights, interactions, complex motion, all the kind of stuff that you can't very easily do with optical.
Yep.
So probably my favorite system, which I have actually sitting behind me as we speak, is one of the biggest investments that I've ever made as a production company into equipment, which was the XN's MVN suits.
Okay. And how much are those?
I'm not actually sure I'm allowed to tell you how much they cost.
Got it.
But it was well over 30,000 euros. It was the price of a sports car, basically.
Wow. Okay.
Not a high-end sports car, but a cheap sports car. But hey, I live in Edinburgh. I don't need to drive. Yep. So they are brilliant. They are absolutely superb technology. And they're basically black magic.
Have you investigated some of the prosumer, affordable for the average person? I mean, it's still not relative to most people's salaries, it's still expensive. But compared to the rest of the market, it's incredibly cheap. Is systems like the Noidum neuron perception.
Yes,
yes. And then there's another one that Salto, but they changed their name recently to Rococo.
Yes, it's interesting actually. I haven't used either the Neuron or the Rococo, but I have friends who are working with both of them. So the Neuron looks... Well, it was remarkable because it was the first inertial system that came out at that sort of price point. The first thing I would look at for any inertial system is how good its step tracking is.
Yep.
Because if you don't have step tracking, then as soon as you try to do anything complicated, you have to manually key the steps, and that is an absolute pain in the butt. So the reason I didn't buy a competing system to the MVN, one of the reasons the XN systems are so good is that their step tracking basically looks like you've got a lighthouse sensor on the guy. It's amazing.
Wow.
It's almost impossible to screw up. I mean, when I was doing testing for it, I really, really tried to break it. I had the guy who I had sort of acting as the motion capture actor. He was literally running up and down this hall doing running jumps, and the system was just going, "Yeah, we're fine. We can track that, no problem."
Wow.
Don't know quite how they were doing it. This comes back to left-hand path. I think there was a certain amount of sacrificing to those who chafe their bonds involved in the development process. It is crazy advanced, but it does it. It works very well. It occasionally, if you do a long jump, it will occasionally slightly misjudge the distance of the jump. And bearing in mind it is just using inertial and gyro tracking data, that's ridiculous.
Yep.
For steps, I have almost never seen it get anything wrong.
Wow.
The Neuron, to the best of my knowledge, has no step tracking whatsoever.
Yep. You very much have to put an X on the floor and constantly recalibrate yourself after each that I've seen. Does it actually just, when you bring in the capture data, does it have you walking on the spot, or does it actually have positional data? So that's why I haven't actually used it myself. I've just done a lot of read up on it. So I can't particularly comment on exactly what the cleanup looks like.
My understanding is that it's walking on the spot stuff, which is a pain to clean up. It's a nightmare. Having said that, with smart camera angles, you can easily get around that problem. A friend of mine, Damien Valentine, who is one of the longest-running Machinima creators in the world, he does some astonishing stuff. He's been using the Perception Neuron for his latest project. And as I recall, from reports from him and various other people, the other issue with it is it's kind of finicky. You have to store it very carefully. It's susceptible to magnetic interference.
Yep.
So it sounds like a pain to set up.
Yeah, most people buy a magnetic, basically a Faraday cage to put it in. Do you have to basically buy a box to put it in when you're not using it?
Yeah. I don't know how durable it is. So another MVN story, and I'm honestly not getting commission from these guys. But one of the other reasons I didn't buy one of the competing systems to MVN was one of the other things I choreographed while I was testing it was a fight scene.
Yep.
And about halfway through the fight scene, when it was me and the guy I was working with, and sort of kneeing him, and there was a bit of a Muay Thai clinch going on. The salesman actually panicked and stopped us and said, "No, you can't do that. You can only do that if you pay for it yourselves." And I'm like, "Well, I'm going to use this thing for intensive production. If you're telling me that you're worried it's going to break, I'm not going to buy it from you."
Yep.
Did the same thing with the MVN system, and at one point I actually thought, because the sales guys were dead silent. And this was when I had the guy I was working with, who was like 6'6" Finn, and I was literally doing knee strikes into his arm at about half force, and noticed that my knee strikes were hitting him right on the inertial sensor. And so I went, "Hang on, guys, is this okay?" And the week beforehand, the guys who were selling this to me had been on set on the Wolverine movie with the stunt people doing the fight scenes there. And so they're Dutch, and so my Dutch accent is appalling. I will apologise for it now. The guy just looks back at me and goes, "Oh no, it is fine. The actor will break before the suit does." Okay. And that's actually one of the main reasons I bought it. So I don't know how durable the Neuron is, but that would always be one of the things I would think about with an inertial suit.
Yep. It's just the durability of it.
I haven't used it myself again, but I've got a friend of mine who's working with, it's the Rococo, is that it? The Danish.
Yeah, that would be the other one. And so they originally, during the Kickstarter several years ago, they were like, "We're going to sell this for $700. And then they ended up refunding a bunch of people because now they've basically come out, "Well, this costs a whole lot more than we thought, and now it's $2,500.
Yeah, which is still peanuts for an inertial suit.
Yeah.
I've looked at their demos, and they've got solid looking step tracking in there, and I've not heard anything about requiring a Faraday cage, so that's two good things. And the person I know who is using it seems to be quite impressed with it. So, it would probably be the one I would look at.
What would you say for people who want to do finger tracking? Would you say it's just better right now with the technology, at least on the lower scale, to just animate the fingers yourself as opposed to trying to capture it?
That's actually a really interesting question. I have just been hearing recently about some of the glove solutions that are coming out for VR, and I will probably be acquiring or looking to get demo copies of some of those ASAP, and that would probably be the thing I would look at for finger tracking. You can actually a lot of the time get away with just a few basic finger poses as morphs, or indeed not animating the hands at all. I do surprisingly often. This is one of the hilarious things about having a Machinima background. If I talk to conventional animators for any length of time, they tend to start looking vaguely green and needing to throw up because I use a lot of shortcuts. And one of them is, most of the time, you don't actually need to animate the hands very much. But if I wanted to do motion capture, I would be looking at things like the, what is it? Look at Google VR gloves. I think it may even be called the VR glove.
There was one at E3 that won a bunch of awards, I think, this year, and that might be the one you're referring to.
There's a few of them, and I believe that at least some of them are very good. So I would be looking at that.
There's a V glove, a high five glove, VR glove.
It's the high five glove. The high five glove I have heard good things about, like really quite solid things about. So that's probably what I'd use. The only thing we're really missing at this point is a good facial animation solution.
Yep.
Which I don't have any recommendations
for. There was some interesting things, at least as far as like trying to do things with faces. So there's a company here in Boston called Effectiva. What they're trying to do is, based on your face emotion, to determine like what your mood is. So if you're like happy versus scared, I think you could see how you could change the content of the experience relative to how the user's feeling.
That's cool. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, that kind of links to one of the things that I've always used as a sort of benchmark for my facial animation is Ken Perlin, who was the guy who invented Perlin Noise, did a very, very effective minimal facial animation demonstration, which I think is still available on the web a while ago. And it shows just how much you can get out of basically having 5 or 6 emotional states.
Yeah.
So if you can do that, and you can do eye tracking, and you can do convincing lip syncing, honestly, 90% of that, the way they are with faces.
And then you have your virtual actors where they're almost one-to-one. There wouldn't be that much cleanup after.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in terms of sort of facial motion capture systems, I was having a conversation about this just the other day. They all tend to require a lot of setup. They don't tend to be particularly high quality, and they're all really expensive.
Yep. And that's where animators are still in business for that.
Or puppetry. The approach that I used way back when on Bloodspell actually still works pretty well. If you can just use whatever recording system Unity's got built-in animation recording now, and you just puppet the thing manually, 2 or 3 passes will give you pretty good facial animation.
Yeah, and there's some good morphs out there that you can use too as well. So.
Yeah. I quite like face effects for lip sync. That works pretty well.
Noted. Yeah, I'll add that to the show notes for sure. All right, so we're near the end of our time here. So is there anything else that you wanted to kind of shout out or let people know about?
Well, the obvious thing that I would definitely like to let people know is that Left Hand Path is available on Steam right now for $29 or equivalent in local currency. It's currently sitting at 85% positive on Steam. We've got a lot of positive reviews after we exited early access, which is really nice. VR Focus gave us 4 out of 5. So enjoy. And if you do play Left Hand Path, one of the things... So I'm actually going to go on a little mini rant here.
Yep.
There are very few advantages that independent developers have over AAAs. But one of the advantages we do have is that we can actually talk to people playing the game one-to-one. And if you have a problem, the lead developer can actually sit down and solve it. And so... I have a standard thing which not enough people take me up on, which is if you buy Left Hand Path and you have a problem, it doesn't work how you expect, the gestures won't recognize, whatever, please don't just go to Steam and refund it. This isn't a AAA. Get in touch with me. I respond to almost all emails within 24 hours, and I will attempt to solve your problem, and I will probably succeed. I nearly always do. If you have any comments on the game, if there's bits you liked and want to see again, please do get in contact. If I was doing VR for the money, I would not be doing games. I'm doing VR because it is
you
a
would open up
storytelling
subways is what you would do, and because they average around 70 to 80,000 per franchise. And that's why when anyone says, like, should I get into game development? I'm like, well, if you want money, you should probably open up a Subway.
Amusingly, I'm not inconsiderably an expert on the subject of how to make money, because at one point when I was making films, I decided to follow sort of Tim Ferriss's Muse business approach, and it's actually very doable. So yes, I would heartily agree. There are a lot of ways of making a lot of money out there. I am aware of most of them. If I was wanting to make a lot of money, I would be doing those. And in VR, I would be making a flight simulator, because there are a lot of pilots out there. Pilots' licenses are really expensive. And if you can give them a good simulator that shaves, $5,000 off the cost of their private pilot's license, they are going to buy a Vive for that. So I'm in games in VR because I get to make worlds, and I love doing that, and I love giving people these experiences, and so I want to hear about those experiences, good or bad. I want to find out how I can make them better, and I want to find out what worked.
Yeah, it's kind of funny that you mentioned kind of pilots VR. So some of the bigger names out there, so even Fortune 500 companies, are switching to using consumer grade VR for training, as opposed to the millions and millions that they've spent since the 80s making these flight simulators.
I'm not surprised.
And the reason is because you can add new things so much faster than trying to have someone learn this old code base. And you kind of get off the ground faster. So at Boston VR, I feel like 2 months ago, it was around September, we actually had someone FedEx come in, who's one of their VR folks, and their use case is that they want to train their mechanics. So it's not for pilots.
Yeah.
But it was pretty cool stuff in that the business case is very easy. There's an instant ROI because, a real plane, if it's not in the sky, you're losing $250,000 a day. And
absolutely.
So, 4 or 5 days, if you can just save that, right, you've already paid more than enough in the first month of your VR system. So it's just very easy. So they are doing things like that. So training is like one of the biggest things for VR right now. So if you do want to go out there and make money, find a company that needs VR training and work it out with them.
Off the top of my head, I would have said the three biggest obvious places where you can make a small fortune or a large fortune in VR right now would be training. Absolutely. And there are so many industries that could use that. You could easily sit there for the rest of your life just doing one a year. Yeah. Medical, military, obviously, is huge. But basically, literally any industry that uses a piece of equipment that costs more than a Vive, if you break it, will probably pay for a simulator. So farming's a really big one. Anything in the food line is huge. Any kind of industrial work, of a biscuit factory. There is probably a machine in the biscuit factory that costs them more than the price of a VR headset every time someone breaks it.
Or cuts their hand or loses fingers and all those things where it's just dangerous.
Absolutely. I would also say that wellness in all its various forms is huge for VR. The thing I always say about VR when is that it's a comparatively expensive gaming platform, but it's a damn cheap treadmill.
Are you familiar with Virzoom?
I'm not, no.
Oh, so they're a company...
Oh, you say on the bike.
Yep, there you go. Yeah, so they're based out of Boston as well. So they're kind of doing that and kind of pushing it towards gyms right now, but they also have a consumer level thing where they realize that not everyone, if you live in a really small place, you don't really have a place to put a bike. So they released, like if you already have a bike, a little accelerometer that can basically count steps. So that way you can just use your phone to do the experience rather than having a Vive and that kind of thing. So it makes it, again, a little bit more accessible and democratic to do those kinds of things. And so another application, if you listen to our 4th episode of our podcast, I think it's titled Healthcare, but we interview Julia Dobler and kind of go through her experience of recovery and how she unwittingly found that VR made her be able to recover much faster and kind of reduce the amount of pain that she felt. Because she went from bedridden to walking much faster just because she would use VR to kind of soothe that pain and also entertain when otherwise you would just be like, great, now I'm just sitting here. So definitely check that out if you're interested in healthcare.
That's interesting. Actually, I'd also add to that. I just recently heard about the applications for VR and rehab. You can also, of course, because particularly if you get a couple of Vive trackers, you have effectively a motion capture system there. And the biggest users of motion capture are not the entertainment industry, they're bioinformatics people. So you can use it in all sorts of ways for physical rehab and psychological rehab as well. Another idea that I would be doing if I was wanting to make money is I would be looking at the papers on effective use of VR in psychotherapy. And then I would be cross-referencing with the area with enough regulation that you won't go mad trying to do it. And then I would be using it as a way to treat social anxiety, for example.
Yep.
There are a lot of people out there with social anxiety, and the pain point of, you cannot go out in public, or it is incredibly difficult and unpleasant for you to interact in a large crowd or whatever, is the kind of thing that you can do a lot of good and will make a lot of money from solving. So, there's so many of these. There's so much
opportunity for social good. And we kind of keep coming back to if I wanted to make money. And so now we want to really bring it back in, because this is partly why I ended up reaching out to come on the podcast, as you mentioned that indie devs have a very difficult time getting VR games out right now. Like there's specific big names that aren't even covering indie VR titles just because they feel their market, the market isn't big enough for them to be covering, indie Vive games or indie Oculus games, and so that already cuts out millions of people that you can't even reach. Because what's interesting to me is that you are, a well-known person, and you're talking about, gosh, it's really difficult to get my game out there and have people discover it and find out about it.
This is actually what alarms me so much about the current discovery situation. Is not only am I comparatively well known, I'm also a marketing expert. I'm stone cold. I get invited to speak at international conferences on this, marketing expert. And for Left Hand Path's release, I have been working with a very, very well-known press consultant who has done wonders. But even given all of that, it has still been tough to get the word out. Now, some of that is because I chose a really stupid release date. Or not stupid, there were good business reasons for doing it, but don't release in Q4. Pro tip. Just don't.
Noted.
But even given that, the extent to which it is very hard to get the word out is concerning to me. I mean, I was able to get the word out a lot more because, I can write a really good headline. I know people. I know how to do this stuff. I'm not afraid of phoning up newspapers, all this kind of thing. But for someone who is like, maybe developing their first thing, and they haven't competed with Hollywood to get press for 20 years, and they don't have the bona fides I do, and all this kind of thing. I see a lot of games go out there, a lot of VR games go out there with almost no publicity, and it's concerning. And it's concerning that, for example, even the big VR title, the VR publications, and I know there's good reasons for this, but a lot of the indie games don't get any kind of coverage there, and you're on social media it's quite hard to get anything beyond the barest sort of we released this thing and maybe a couple of people checked it out,
right? And
Steam's discovery systems don't seem to be doing quite as well.
Steam is not what it used to be as far as discoverability, because now they have hundreds of games coming out every month, to where I think it might even be in the thousands by now. Whereas, 10 years ago, there were a couple hundred games to choose from. So if you're on Steam, you're pretty much making money because of the player base compared per title.
Because of the exclusivity, yeah. And I very much see why they decided to drop Greenlight, but I'm not convinced it was the right move.
We'll see. It's kind of too early to tell, at least from my end. But if you have any comments on it, I'll let you go talk on that.
It feels a bit like it's heading in the direction that the app stores headed in.
I see.
And that's alarming, because the app stores are the app stores are a nightmare. If you're not very, very well funded, the app stores are pretty horrible places to get the word out about anything.
Yeah, and it's definitely kind of going where it actually already is, where Steam, you can't expect people to find your game on Steam just because you released it. No. You are responsible for driving traffic to your Steam page, and that's where indies who are releasing their first title have big challenges, because they don't know all the marketing, they don't know how to make a press release, they don't know how to even communicate with press without being awkward or feeling forced, or building those relationships. Yep. Sorry
to break in. I think one of the things that concerns me is, even if you do due diligence, even if you learn how you should write a press release, you actually send the press releases out, you do your social media platforms to the best of your ability. If you haven't studied copywriting, if you don't know how to craft a headline, which is a pretty non-standard piece of thing to know, if you are not a professional marketer with the knowledge that comes from doing this for years, if you are just an indie dev who is doing his or her best, and really is, you've spent the time, you've set aside a month to do your launch, you've done everything right that is reasonable to expect of you. I think this is my concern, is that if an indie dev who is not a marketing professional or is not already well known in the VR space right now does everything that is reasonable to expect of them to do to get the word out about their game, it seems like it's often not working, and that's not good for them. That's not good for the VR community, because we might miss our next Minecraft, and this is what really worries me. Notch, as it turns out, was pretty good at getting the word out, but we might miss the killer app, and that's really worrying, particularly in a time when people are looking at VR skeptically and saying, there aren't really the sales there.
Yeah, and it's in some ways it's self-fulfilling when you have people like I pretty sure IGN's one of them, basically saying we're not going to cover it. Like, there's just too much other stuff going on. People aren't that interested in it. And until there's, a larger, they'll cover like PlayStation VR just because that player base is there. But I'm just kind of spitballing numbers here, so don't take these one-to-one, but kind of combined, I think Oculus and Vive have around like a 2 million install base at some point throughout this year. It may be more now, might be less. But it's not that big, whereas PlayStation VR hit over 1 million just last year.
One of the things that actually worries me about this is I think a significant number of the people who have Oculus and Vive are currently pretty inactive in the VR scene.
Yep.
And that means that the coverage, if they're going to hear about a new VR experience, it's got to come from a non-VR source because they're not following the VR sources.
And well, there's that, and there's so many headsets coming out, and now it's like, oh great, how do I make my game work on the Microsoft headset? And that's great. Another platform you have to be on, because right now I feel like you have to put yourself out on 4 different platforms, 5 if you include trying to get into VR-cades.
Yeah, it's tough. It's tough. I don't really know what we do about this, but I think it's worth raising awareness of the fact that, if you are in the VR community, how many genuinely new titles from new developers have you looked at in the last month? You might have looked at you might have looked at Skyrim VR, but that's not exactly new. You might have looked at the second installment of the Gallery, or you might have checked out Talos Principle or whatever. But all of these things, the inverse square law is always brutal for any art form. Again, I spent 20 years competing with Hollywood.
Yep.
I'm that's just a reality of life. But it's a nasty combination in VR with the small user base that could cause us problems down the line. I'm doing a bit of thinking at the moment about how to combat this discoverability thing.
And that's part of like what our podcast came out of is even outside of gaming, it's been very difficult for just VR in general to try and get what's out. And we wanted to kind of raise discovery of what's going on in Boston, but as well as like what's going on creatively out there. And just kind of provide a voice or platform that you can go to get that word out. And that's kind of what we're trying to do here. So thank you for being a part of that.
No problem at all. If there's anything else I can do to help, do let me know. I will actually, in that case, quickly shout out a new VR game that I've recently tried, which is really good, Racket NX. I don't know how new it is, but I'd only heard about it yesterday, and genuinely, it's superb. I've never heard of the developers. I've never seen the game reviewed anywhere. I'm sure it has been somewhere, but I've never seen it.
Yep.
And it's one of my favorite VR titles of the year.
Awesome. And is it Racket X or
Racket as in racquetball NX?
Oh, okay. That's on PlayStation VR, is it?
Is it? Right, okay. Well, in that case, I may have just shout out.
There might be another game that's similar that I'm thinking of, but we'll figure that out in the show notes and make it clear. So,
cool.
But
yeah, that's a really impressive VR experience. So it's definitely worth looking at.
Excellent, and I feel like I could talk to you, for a whole another hour if we had the time. So thank you for everyone, and thanks you, Hugh Hancock from Strange Company, creators of Left Hand Pass. So definitely check that out on Steam. It came out on November 10th. And this has been another episode of the Virtuality Podcast. We'll see you in this reality.
And the next.
Thank you so much for listening. We would like to keep sharing more about VR and AR with you, so please consider a few dollars to our Patreon, linked in the show notes. The Virtuality Podcast is produced by Jason Parks and music by Rachel Dazinski. This podcast is in collaboration with Boston VR and Boston AR. Monthly meetups and events can be found on meetup.com. You can also follow us on Twitter @VirtualityCast and learn more at our website, virtuality.show.